Week 5, Lesson 1. Superheroes aren't selling. World War II ended with the start of the atomic age. Germany had surrendered, unable to fight a two-front war, and the Japanese surrendered when 2 atomic bombs were dropped on their country. The Axis had failed in their attempts for conquest, and the Soviets had taken half of Europe. Americans were stationed in both Japan and Germany in order to rebuild them. American soldiers were passing on their comics to kids in both countries, which allowed for a new generation each country to be exposed to American comics for potentially the first time. This is a point when American comics first had a huge impact in Central Europe, and in Japan, which would alter the future of comics in those places. Back at home was a different story. There was a changing trend beginning to emerge. Superheroes were not selling. The most famous example is when Captain Marvel sales dropped by 2.5 million copies between 1945 and 1947. But he wasn't the only one losing sales. The superhero genre took such a hit that only 3 characters were constantly being written from the 1940s up until today. Those characters are Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Every other Golden Age character created before America entered the war went out of print, at least temporarily. There were some reasons for this. Superheroes were starting to lose the initial novelty. Superheroes had been around constantly for about 7 years and had a lot of competition between each other. They were strongmen that were dressed in capes and fought crime. If you dissect it, that's what the vast majority of superheroes were. They were simplistic characters too. They didn't have nuances or eternal conflicts, and the villains proved no match for them. This leads us to another reason superhero comics are starting to fail. The children, especially young boys, who'd become the primary demographic throughout the war, were growing up, and the characters were not growing up with them. The boys were starting to become interested in other genres. Another thing was the propaganda. Remember in the previous video how everyone was preparing to fight Hitler? Well, that had happened. Hitler had been completely defeated. His war machine was destroyed, and the comics did their job to bring people's attentions to his actions. Those comics were no longer needed. And it was almost impossible for comics to fight real-world threats as big as the Nazis. Another thing was that the fantasy of combat wasn't the same as actual combat. Soldiers who went to the front lines to attack the Nazis and Japanese military weren't getting the same effect of super beating up villains as they used to before they experienced combat. And children who read about costume do-gooders were now starting to read about real heroes, men without powers, who put on a uniform and fought overseas. Or civilians that risked everything to fight back against invaders. So, for all these reasons, superheroes were struggling. But the story of comics is not exclusively the story of superheroes. The lack of sales led to a void in the market which other genres had a chance to fill. And with the clean, family-friendly superhero genre disappearing, more mature, grittier genres popped up to take their place. This would change the way that comics were viewed by the general public. Instead of being a dominant selling force, superheroes were limited to a small genre surrounded by other books that youth wanted to read. In theory, this would have led to an amazing versatile marketplace, which had strong sales for both boys and girls and adults of all ages. In reality, these changes almost led to the destruction of the American comic book industry. This week, we're going to look at the 3 main genres that gained popularity when superheroes stopped selling, and the controversy that those genres caused. This led to the fall of the market influence from both Timely and DC Comics, as well as a rise to a new company that we'll look at, which led to the biggest genre boom in comics since the rise of the superhero. This will probably be the busiest week of the course, as we have a lot of ground to cover since we'll deal with the darker side of comics and their potentially harmful effect on American youth. Questions to contemplate. Can you think of another reason that I didn't mention in this video why superhero comics might have been falling in sales?